Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing this on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please, if you do not already support this podcast and support long-form conversation, I would invite you to join our community at Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/Matt Lewis. All right, we have a very interesting topic today. I would say very thought-provoking. Aaron Sibarium is back to talk about a really interesting new essay. It's called The Weimarization of the American Republic. America is not Weimar Germany, but there are troubling historical echoes in our politics today. Aaron Sibarium, welcome to the news.
Thank you for having me.
I should say welcome back to the news. This is your second time. It is great to have you back. And I have to say, this essay was, again, thought-provoking. I was going to say controversial. I don't know that it was controversial. Did this arouse any controversy?
Well, I think there were a range of takes on it, and some people agreed with it maybe more than others. But, let's see. I mean, I was worried it was going to get me in a lot of trouble, parts of it. And if it did, I didn't really see it. I'm sure there were some people who were outraged, but aside from like one or two kind of tanky types on Twitter who whined about, supposedly, excusing fascism or whatever, aside from kind of that predictable resistance type stuff, no, there wasn't really no one got that angry at me, which actually sort of surprised me. And in fact, one thing that was very interesting was that a lot of people from across the ideological spectrum actually liked the essay, including people who were, diametrically opposed to each other. So, for example, Steve Saylor tweeted it favorably, and so did Ann Applebaum and Shadi Hamid, right? And
that's a lot of range.
Yeah, that's
for
a
those
lot.
keeping score. That's the
that's
nationalist far right. That's the liberal. How would we describe Ann? Internationalist, maybe.
Like never
then,
Trump internationalist, soft neocon.
So it's a lot of range. I think this piece, it came out right before the election, and I think I just got around to really doing a deep dive into it because it's long and it's substantive, and I think maybe it got overshadowed a bit by the election. So I wanted to talk about it in detail. But for those who don't know exactly or don't recall, why don't you just tell us? It's called the Weimarization of the American Republic. What was Weimar?
Yeah, so Weimar was the German liberal democracy between 1918 and 1933. So it was after the Kaiser was deposed in the German Revolution after World War I. And it lasted for, I guess, about 25 years until eventually Hitler took power and inaugurated the Third Reich. But Weimar is seen in sort of, conventional historiography as an example of a, deeply divided, very fragile, young democracy that just kind of crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. It's famous for having these street brawls between communists and fascists, among other things, but that's one of the kind of primary images that it's known for. And so I had it in mind during the summer when, in the wake of the George Floyd shooting, there were all these protests that turned violent, and you saw Antifa and Proud Boys and whoever, fighting in the street, and police police stations getting burned down, all this stuff. And I thought, oh, I don't know that much about Weimar Germany, but this sure sounds a little Weimar-esque. Huh? I should read some stuff about it, and I wonder if there are parallels. And sure enough, as I was reading, a lot of parallels jumped out to me. So that's more or less how the essay was born.
Yeah, no, I've sort of just intuitively thought the same thing, but I didn't take the time to do that deep dive and to do the reading, and I didn't have the institutional knowledge. I mean, other than just the basics, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
But you really did it, and so you quote, for example, at the top of this column or this essay, you quote Walter Laqueur. I don't know how it's pronounced.
yeah.
But
Sure.
he's an American who wrote a cultural history of Weimar, I think in 1974. And man, when you read the quote, what he is describing, it sounds like modern America. Was his book one of the sort of fundamental, books that you read when you were brushing up on this?
Yeah, that was probably the one that most of it ended up coming from. It wasn't the only one. I guess the first book I read was just like a broader sort of overview of the Weimar Republic by, I think, oh, God, I don't remember how you pronounce his name, but it was a pretty famous kind of standard treatment of it. But the Liqueur book, I think, had the most stuff on the cultural dynamics and particularly on how left and right intellectuals kind of ended up almost confirming each other's stereotypes. And I think there is this more revisionist strain of Weimar historiography that's kind of implicit now in a lot of the uh, Antifa discourse, where people say, well, I mean, in Nazi Germany or before Nazi Germany, there were the fascists and the anti-fascists, referencing Antifa, and the anti-fascists were the good guys, right? Duh. And in fact, when you go back and look at it, I mean, both the left-wing street fighters and the left-wing intellectuals in Weimar, uh, they were not really the good guys. I mean, they were actually unrepentant communists in many cases. They were violent. They, justified political violence. They thought that the centrist liberal parties were fascists. I mean, these guys were nuts, and they were not doing the legitimacy of the republic any favors. So yeah, like I mean, the Liqueur book goes through that in some length, and particularly talks a lot about the intellectual polarization in Germany, which is probably, to me, that's the parallel in some ways. That hits closest to home. The polarization of sort of the intellectuals and the elite class,
And
as well as kind
you,
of
I mean,
the oikophobia and the sort of hatred of the country.
yeah, no, that's where I want to go to. I'm gonna get to that, but you see, I mean, you start off by making like the obvious point, which is like America. This is not, America's not exactly like this, right? We haven't
Right,
lost a
right.
world war. We haven't been forced to pay debt. We've had 250 years of democracy, not 25. Trump is not Hitler. But then you write, what recalls interwar Germany is not the chaos itself, but the way it has been excused, even encouraged by those notionally in a position to stop it, many of whom seem ambivalent about whether the republic it threatens deserves defense. This does seem to be a pretty good description of America today, right?
Yeah,
People on the right, people on the right view what Trump talks a lot about all the things America's done wrong, and they view America as kind of soft and weak, and certainly like liberal democracy as being soft and weak. And then people on the left, you go to like the 1619 Project and all that, they're not terribly proud of America. So you end up having a lot of people on the left and the right who just aren't that committed to the republic.
yeah. No, that's exactly right. And I mean, obviously, you don't want to exaggerate. I mean, Weimar, the republic, had only existed for a couple years, and it was a very different culture, different history. And so, I mean, I don't think that the oikophobia is quite as deeply rooted in the United States as in Weimar. But yes, I mean,
And this means, and you've used this term twice,
yeah,
oikophobia. This is a like a hatred of your homeland or your culture.
yeah, 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 exactly. But I think it's become much stronger on the left in even just my exceedingly short lifetime. I mean, look, in high school, I'm trying to think back. I was in high school like, uh, you know, less than 10 years ago. In high school, I would say the dominant sort of left liberal culture was critical of aspects of the United States, but ultimately saw progressive ideas and values as, in some sense, you know, advancing the Constitution or redeeming the country. And it was, progressivism, I think, was sort of conceived of itself as making good on the promise of America. Um, and now, right, with the 1619 Project, and it's really just a symptom, of course, of a much broader intellectual movement. I think there's a lot more, to put it mildly, ambivalence among the chattering class about whether the United States actually is a good country whose founding was, on balance, like, a good thing worth honoring. And that's where sort of the Weimarization of the left has occurred a bit. And as you say, on the right, I think you're right that there's a certain degree of maybe oikophobia among Trumpists, and kind of the critique of America as soft and as having made all these mistakes. I would say that the most extreme form on the right, though, isn't really uh, Trumpism, which kind of wants to make America great again, implying that there is some core of America that is great or can be great. I would say the most extreme form of oikophobia on the right is sort of the Patrick Deneen post-liberalism that's gained currency among some intellectuals, which really does uh, say, I mean, look, this is a quote from Patrick Deneen. I'm not making it up. It says, the atomistic philosophy of the founders, like, you know, was always destined to dissolve our civic institutions. I mean, if you blame the founding of the country itself for our kind of all of our problems today, it's hard to see how you can really be patriotic and hold such a view. Um, I don't think that Patrick Deneen speaks for most Americans or even most American intellectual conservatives, but I do think that his ideas would not have been really discussed anywhere near to the degree that they have been discussed in the past uh, 4 years had it not been for Trump. And so, yes, I mean, there is a sense in which Trump has opened up the door on the right to much more radical
Yeah.
critiques of the American project. And, you know, I don't think I wouldn't bet that Denism really goes anywhere. But on the other hand, there were a lot of people who scoffed at wokeness and thought, back in the 70s and 80s, oh, this stuff is BS, it can't go anywhere. And, under the right conditions, we've seen it can go somewhere.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't bet on Patrick Deneen taking over the American right, but I also do think that that strain of kind of right wing post liberalism, it certainly gained more traction than anyone would have imagined in like the 1990s.
Yeah, oh, totally. I mean, I'm older than you. I remember the 1990s and that era. I mean, look, there's always been something of a romanticization of the left, but that didn't happen at all on the right. I mean, if you were to the right of Ronald Reagan, you were a kook, and you were not cool. This was not
Yeah.
something you wanted to be. It wasn't romantic or exciting to be and so that wasn't celebrated at all. I think it's been somewhat romantic, portrayed as romantic to be on the left, but even still, I mean, I think like John F. Kennedy and Bill Clinton were kind of like portrayed as like the epitome of cool in politics, and so it was a very mainstream sort of thing. But as you write, you're talking about Weimar here, status attached to radicalism. So most status-seeking individuals sought to subvert the republic, lest they be viewed as supporting it. If you liked Weimar, you were either anti-German or anti-worker, and who wanted to be one of those? Here's what I find interesting about this. There are some people who are true ideologues, but a lot of people just want to be cool, just want to have power, just want to be famous. And then the question is, what are those incentives? If you want to be a political rock star like AOC or whoever's, Marjorie Taylor Greene, if you want to be like, what are the incentives? Like, let's just say, I feel like there was a time when the incentive would have been to be a mainstream Republican if you're on the right, and now the incentive is to go to the extremes, even if you're not an ideologue, just if you want to be popular and famous.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's completely true, and social media obviously hasn't helped with that at all. That's one thing that Weimar did not have. But yeah, I do think what strikes me is it is now seen on both sides, I think, as kind of cool or chic or edgy to float these radical theories about the fundamental depravity of the United States. So on the left, obviously, 1619, America founded on slavery, racism, and you see AOC. I mean, she basically recapitulates all that rhetoric. I'm not sure that she frames it in maybe quite the maximalist terms as say Nicole Hannah Jones or some other journalists might, but she certainly flirts with the rhetoric. And then on the right, I mean, I can say from just experience that among kind of young intellectual conservatives, the cool, hip, edgy thing is, kind of wink and a nod, flirting with monarchy or some like, just crazy anti-American kind of right-wing romanticism. It's not totally serious, but it's seen as kind of cool or hip if you are into, either like there's species of kind of like secular neo-reactionary thought on some corners of the internet that's kind of seen as cool or edgy, like Molbug, for instance, if people know who that is. But then among the more religious folks, it's kind of the Catholic integralism or kind of like Joseph de Maistre type, radical critiques of liberalism. And it's interesting because I'm not sure how ideological all of it is, right? I don't know if either the kind of performative young intellectuals in DC or the performative woke squad in Congress, I don't know if they truly deeply believe all this. Maybe they believe it, but it's not a particularly deeply held belief. I'm not sure. But I do think that it's just mimetically kind of seen as a cool, hip thing. And that does affect culture and that does affect politics in the long run. If, what is socially valued is radicalism, you don't have to necessarily believe in it on a deep fundamental level, in the way that I suspect some of the communists or fascists in Weimar really did believe in it, for it to still be a problem. And indeed, even in Weimar, a lot of the street fighters weren't actually all that ideologically committed, and the reason that is a lot of the street fighters switch sides. there was this very well-known pattern that both the communists and the fascists complained about, where they had trouble kind of keeping their recruits, I retaining their recruits, because they'd sort of be like, oh yeah, we like the fascists, we like beating up commies. Oh, but like the communists are really getting edgier and more militant. I don't know, maybe we should go over to that side. And some of them really did, because it was more about just wanting to fight and wanting to be radical and against the system. Um, and but the issue was that because elites, on both the left and the right, were still ideologizing the violence and kind of, forcing it into this ideological conflict, it it ended up having the effect of being political violence, even if the many of the actors committing the violence weren't themselves terribly political. So, people will say things like, well, do these kids really believe in what they're saying? And they don't necessarily have to believe it for it to be harmful. It just the ideological memes, once they're out there and once they start attaching to violence, I think can kind of take on a logic of their own, independent of the sort of mental states or motivations of individual violent actors. And I think that that's an important nuance that often gets lost in a lot of these debates.
Right. So you write that, in Weimar, each side came to resemble and thus justify the other's caricatures, and that by coding everyone as either a Nazi or a commie, the political culture laid the groundwork for political violence. If social democrats were really fascist, as the communists claim, the social democratic Reichstag was already a dictatorship, impossible to resist through peaceful means, whereas if they were Bolsheviks or even Bolshevik sympathizers, preserving order would paradoxically require insurrection. So, a lot of big words there. It's a very well written and again thought provoking piece. But I mean, this point you're making here, I think, is really interesting. I mean, if we really are fighting, and I'll use let me bring it to modern times, right? Like,
Mhm.
if Trump really is a fascist, if he really is Hitler, then like uh, extremism in defense of liberty is is no vice,
Yeah.
right? It
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
justifies anything that people might want to do when you. So, like, one consequence of this degree of polarization is that it justifies an ends justifies the means mentality.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why I have been, I mean, not alarmed, but certainly concerned about the coup talk, uh, from the left as well as the right, in its own way. Because, if you think that there's actually a coup underway, it it presumably justifies some pretty radical
Yeah.
actions. And,
And let
now
me
the
say, Trump was the first to talk about a
yeah,
coup
oh yeah,
with the
yeah,
deep state. So he injected that irresponsible language
yes.
himself. But I get where you're going with this.
Yeah, so I think he bears a lot of blame for this, and I think people like Michael Anton, who talked about the coming coup of Democrats trying to steal the election, that was uh, shameful. I mean, I don't think he's a traitor to the regime, as one guy called him on Twitter, and that was, not. There were some overreactions even there, but yeah, look, like, uh, a lot of the right wingers who've warned about a coup, they're perpetuating this problem, but the left is doing it too. And I will say, and I don't mean this to sound super partisan, but it is the case that at least some folks on the left, well before Trump, were calling essentially mainstream Republicans fascists, or were drawing these kinds of Hitler comparisons. They've certainly intensified under Trump.
Bush,
And
remember
yeah,
Bush Hitler, right? I mean,
yeah. So like,
and yeah,
look, I mean, and I think Trump bears a lot of blame for making those comparisons seem more superficially plausible, and thus kind of greatly multiplying them. And that's bad, because those comparisons delegitimize, the entire American state, basically, in practice. But
If
you
you were, I
know,
mean, if you were a young Republican who supported Mitt Romney, somebody was calling you a fascist,
yeah,
which is
but like,
absurd.
right. I mean, and the other thing is that uh, organizations like the New York Times that are supposed to be gatekeepers and obviously are not anymore. You know, like the people who work at the New York Times should not be calling mainstream Republicans fascists. And if they do call them fascists, they shouldn't be at the New York Times. And the New York Times, frankly, should probably fire them. I mean, if you really are serious about gatekeeping, you do have to police the craziness on the right, but you also have to police the craziness on the left. And if you actually think that, the mainstream GOP is a fascist political party, that requires you to be just so far left and so far kind of wrapped up in a delusional fantasy that I would argue that you too are kind of your own threat to the republic and to democratic norms. And there's a case to be made that gatekeeping should keep the white supremacists out and also keep out the people who believe that everyone to the right of Bernie Sanders is a white supremacist. I mean, both of those sentiments, I think, are in their own way quite harmful to regime legitimacy. And well, I would say that the truly awful kind of racialist stuff on the right is maybe morally worse in some sense than the kind of anti-fascist hysteria on the left. In terms of their concrete effects on politics, I think the left-wing hysteria has a lot more of a foothold, frankly, than white nationalism. And so, I don't really, even if it's motivated by good intentions or whatever, the fact of the matter is it's just as much, if not more, of a legitimacy threat than I think the far right. Um, yeah.
Another thing that you really did a good job of, I've often thought, you know, sort of like rank and file Germans, like why did they go along with Hitler? I mean, that's sort of like the big question, right? And a lot of things go into that, including the Great Depression and a lot of stuff. But like one of the reasons that rarely gets mentioned is that their other choice was communism, right? I mean, like at some
Yeah.
point, it did become like a binary choice, pretty much. They were either going to have like Joseph Stalin esque communism, which they were super afraid of, and they had reason to be, and there was some historical precedent as to why they should be, and the other option was to go to the right, and when I think about like the Squad and Antifa, but then I think about Trump and the Proud Boys, and then I think about like what should like someone who just believes in liberal democracy do, or what? How about the never Trumpers who voted for Biden? You know, it's very timely stuff. And so you're writing. I'm going to read some of what you wrote here. The Social Democrats, that would be the people who believe in the republic, elected democracy. The Social Democrats had a choice: move far enough left to appease the communists, risking a civil war that they would probably lose, or work with the illiberal but numerically dominant right in the hope of keeping its worst elements at bay. Understandably, they saw the latter as the lesser of two evils. We know what happened next. What we don't know is the counterfactual. It's possible that a united left would have defeated the Nazis without succumbing to Stalinism, but given Stalin's influence over the German Communist Party, it's a stretch. I skipped some words, but it's a stretch. To reach détente with the communists, the Social Democrats would have had to embrace the full-scale abolition of private property and the oppression needed to achieve it. Talk about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not necessarily that Weimar had to end up as fascist or communist, but it's that there were strong polarizing pressures that kind of gradually hollowed out the center so that, in practice, that may not have been the only possible outcome, but if you were a social democrat, on the left, like you didn't really have all that many options. And after a certain point, just with the way elections shook out, there wasn't all that much they could do. And I mean, there's a case. You can even put this in the show notes. There's a paper I read that makes this argument at some length, but basically says, look, like the communists just weren't going to accept people as allies who were not really, really left wing. And the fascists were obviously not friends of the social democrats, but there were a lot of people in Germany who were kind of, between the social democrats and the fascists, who were, I'd say, definitely more conservative and maybe illiberal, but were not Nazis and were not fans of the National Socialist Party, including many intellectuals, famous kind of Weimar intellectuals fell into that category. And in that dynamic, right? Yeah, like, what are you going to do? I mean, maybe there's a way that you can keep a far left coalition together and have it not, turn into civil war and it'll all be fine. But the worst case scenario is you actually do have a civil war and the right might crush you. And well, that's not good. And especially in 1930, you really have no way of knowing exactly what Hitler is going to do, or sort of the worst case scenario is on the right. And with imperfect information and sort of with all the kind of good centrist options gradually hollowed out by polarization, yeah, like it's not all that crazy that they would have kind of tolerated a more, it was called the policy of toleration, where they sort of the social democrats tolerated the more, a more conservative Ragstag government. They weren't, endorsing Hitler and they weren't voting for Hitler, but they were allying with conservatives who they thought would be willing and able to resist Hitler. And that was the gambit. And like, hindsight is 2020. It's very easy to say, well, I mean, the Holocaust was just so horrible that any other counterfactual would have been better. And sure, I'm sure that many other scenarios were possible. Many of them would have been better than the one that happened. But you can imagine one where things go really badly and either Hitler comes to power anyway and it's even worse, or you could imagine that like the communists actually won somehow, and then instead of Nazi Germany, you just have East Germany, but in all of Germany, like, several decades earlier. And East Germany, to put it mildly, was not a nice place to live. And a lot of people were killed, and there was a secret police, and it was less anti-Semitic than Hitler, but it was not exactly good for the Jews. There's a lot of Soviet anti-Semitism that people forget about. And so, like, when you understand just both the range of possible outcomes and how horrible a lot of them would have been, I think you can, if not agree with, then at least sympathize with and understand why centrists, might have taken actions that kind of were then, retroactively viewed as sort of selling out to fascism. I mean, it's a lot more complicated. It's not like they just woke up one day and said, "Oh, like actually Hitler, great, kill all the Jews." No, they were trying very hard to prevent that from happening, and but they were also trying hard to prevent Stalinism from happening.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think to your point, kind of modern day with the kind of never Trumper liberal Democrat who looks at both the Squad and Trumpism, you know, again, neither of those things are anywhere near as extreme as the options on offer in Weimar Germany. But it is true, I think, that there are clearly a lot of influential elements of the Democratic Party that really do seek to depart from American liberalism in crucial ways. And there are also those elements on the right too, or at least elements on the right who I think are somewhat indifferent to a lot of the constitutional constraints that historically have constituted, um, American conservatism. So
It's,
yeah, I mean, it's not a good situation, and like I have my views about who it made more sense to vote for in this election, but I I think if you genuinely are a moderate, it's actually not totally obvious who you should have voted for. Um, and of course, most self-proclaimed moderates say that it's obvious you should have voted for Biden. And while I end up coming down more on their side, I don't think that it was at all obvious that if you're worried about the long-term fate of liberal democracy, uh, Joe Biden doesn't present really big risks, owing to the party that is backing him.
yeah. So again, there's so many things that remind me of today, which is the point, which is scary.
Yeah.
But here's one I want to read. I mean, so I was gonna, just the other day, I was working on a column and I was pointing out, and I think this got like deleted or taken out, but I was just pointing out that like, American conservatism is supposed to be about conserving liberal values. It's different than European conservatism. So, in many ways, American conservatism is about conserving liberal values. And but now the left isn't really interested in doing that, and Trumpism is not really. Trumpism is like more radical, not really interested in doing that either. And now here I'm reading this quote from Lacker. Is
Yeah.
that the
Yeah.
author?
Liqueur. I
Lacker. I don't
Yeah.
know. I've probably
Yeah.
mispronounced a lot
Yeah.
in this
Mm-hmm.
conversation, but Lacker. This is the author who wrote about Weimar in this 1974 book, and he writes, many of them were not conservatives in the traditional sense. For what was there to conserve? And then he continues, they were most eloquent in their attacks on liberalism, but they had little to offer of their own. It reminded me of the critique of modern day, conservatives wanting to just own the libs. And there's a meme where it's like Edmund Burke says the definition of conservatism is owning the libs or something like that. And it's like,
Yeah.
wow, this is exactly what was happening, at this crazy time in history.
Yeah, I mean, and indeed, the phrase you hear today from political scientists is negative polarization, where the polarization is driven maybe less by sort of positive ideological commitments than by an overriding sense of dread at the other side taking power. And that certainly does sound very Weimar-esque, where although there probably were more ideologues in Weimar, true ideologues, than there are today, still, as I said earlier, a lot of these guys, it would be a mistake to, I think, impute too much ideology to them. A lot of it was more just a combination of kind of inchoate radicalism, hatred sort of for the country, and then coupled with essentially hyper negative polarization, where the other side was just seen as an illegitimate existential threat that had to be defeated at all costs. Yeah, and like I think again the conservatism is owning the libs is the flip side of progressives thinking that all conservatives are fascists, right? It's an understanding of politics that's purely kind of negative and deconstructive. It doesn't really have any positive content, and the effect of it on both sides is to delegitimize the other side, and by extension to uh, make impossible the maintenance and rehabilitation of the center. Um, and of course, right, the other problem with that is when there is no center, it's very hard for the two sides to come together and compromise, which means it's very hard for them to solve problems. Like, for example, if hypothetically there were a pandemic and businesses had to close and we needed to give businesses economic relief, and the two sides hate each other and their overriding concern is just owning the other and making them look bad, that's not really a recipe for compromise and for getting uh, stimulus legislation or relief legislation passed. And then crises get worse, the economy gets worse, and people feel increasingly like the system doesn't provide for their needs. And when they feel like that, they have fewer reasons to stay invested in the system and thus grow more attracted to radicalism. And so it's a vicious cycle, right? The inability to compromise and have any kind of centrist governance just ends up feeding kind of the negative polarization further, even though the negative polarization is itself, feeding the inability to compromise.
You're right that since America is not Weimar, and it and it is the left rather than the right that controls the culture, I suspect our own despotism, if it comes, will end up being woke instead of trad. Um, was German culture? I mean, I will concede to you that American culture is of the left, right? I mean, the left,
Yes.
Republicans may win elections, but the left controls generally Hollywood, entertainment, academia, all that. The culture. Was German culture controlled by the right?
Yeah, so this is actually an important asymmetry to take note of. I mean, it really was. It was a much more conservative society, and particularly in universities, we think of American universities as kind of left-wing monocultures, where anyone to the right is silenced or afraid of sharing their views. Basically, the same dynamic happened in Weimar Germany, but in the reverse, where it was the right that dominated the universities, and thus kind of all the professions that employ university graduates, including uh, the professional government bureaucracy. So there was the right just had incredible cultural power in Germany relative to what it had in America. I mean, it's not to say that there weren't, there wasn't, it's not like there wasn't left-wing culture. There was, and there were playwrights who were on the left, and there were journalists and others, but the majority of culture shaping institutions in Germany were very right wing. And I think the sort of bourgeois and the sort of you know elite and well to do in Germany, they weren't, again, the majority of them weren't Nazis, but they were certainly not uh liberal Democrats or leftists, and that is a pretty big difference. But it's also a difference that I think predicts, maybe to some extent, what could happen at the end of our own polarization cycle in America, because in Germany there was a lot more institutional and cultural infrastructure for the right to capitalize and build on. Um, so intuitively, it's not all that surprising that the right won out there when there was this polarization cycle, especially since communism and Bolshevism was really more of a Russian import, and German culture German politics and culture just was more right-wing, and there was this kind of established right-wing bureaucracy that Nazism could use that just really has no cousin in America. In America, right, most bureaucratic institutions and most culture shaping institutions, and there's obviously overlap between those two groups, most of those are left wing. And the regnant ideology of bureaucracy and of uh, culture shaping institutions in the United States is very left wing. And Trumpism really is, in certain ways, well, maybe Trumpism is American, but the kind of more like radical strains of it that borrow from kind of European conservative traditions, that stuff is more, I think, of a foreign import. And so, because the dynamics in America are reversed, I don't think it's crazy to think that the left just has a built-in advantage that in the long run will translate into the left being more able to impose some of its illiberal and despotic ambitions on the country. Again, a lot of caveats apply. I don't think we're going to end up in any kind of situation like either Weimar Germany or like the Soviet Union. I know you had Rod Dreher on your podcast a few weeks ago, and I do think it's important to emphasize that if there is going to be totalitarianism in the United States, it is going to be very soft. And that doesn't mean it's not totalitarian in certain ways, but I don't think people are going to be thrown in gulags in the US. But, I do worry that enough elite institutions just get captured by really far left progressivism that, in practice, like, you really do have to watch what you say if you're just a normal guy working at a normal company, because your HR department, backed by the civil rights bureaucracy, really could like end your career and end your life if you say the wrong thing and someone calls you a racist. I mean, that is a real concern, and I think it's growing more and more real as wokeness continues its march to the institutions. So yeah, I that is a difference from Weimar Germany, and it's one reason why, although I suppose I agree with Andrew Sullivan saying that a lot of aspects of America feel very Weimar, I don't agree with people who say, well, the problem with the far left is it'll motivate people to vote for fascists. Like, it can do that, and it did that in Weimar, but a lot of why it did that in Weimar was because a lot of people were already kind of more sympathetic to the right than they were to the communists. And in the US, I worry that the situation may be somewhat reversed. And so, I'd be more inclined to tell right wingers and Trumpists, the reason you shouldn't go super far right is that it could provoke a backlash that you really don't want, where you do end up getting like illiberal hate speech legislation and court packing and other stuff. I think that after the kind of split government results of the 2020 election, that's a little less likely, thankfully, now than it looked maybe 2-3 months ago. But in the long run, I worry more about threats from the far left simply because I think that American culture and American institutions have more elective affinities with the far left than they do with the far right.
All right. Well, there we have it. A thought-provoking, an incredibly well-written piece, and everyone should go read it. It's the Weimarization of the American Republic. And Aaron, how can people who want to follow you on Twitter and read all your stuff, how could they do that?
So my Twitter handle is just at Aaron Sibarium, all lowercase, all one word. And yeah, I post all my writing there. So that's, yeah, you should follow me on Twitter. And I work for the Free Beacon, so you should also follow the Free Beacon on Twitter because the Free Beacon is awesome. And you should follow American Purpose, where this particular essay appeared, because it's a new kind of fledgling publication that I think is doing very good work already and has a lot of potential. So everyone give both of those groups a follow.
All right, do that. And Aaron Siberium, thank you for coming back on the news.
Thank you. Yeah, this was fun. Thank you so much.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.